everyone, I'm Kevin, otherwise known as Form BX257, here to bring you another 1980s and 90s G.I. Joe tour review. And today I'll be taking a look at the G.I. Joe's enormous mobile cannon system, the 1989 Thunderclap, and its included driver, Long Range. Now both the Thunderclap and Long Range make their first comic book appearance in the old mobile comic run of G.I. Joe in issue number 92. And they make their first cartoon appearance together in the DiC animated 1989 5-part miniseries Operation Dragonfire in Part 2. As you can see, the Thunderclap is an extremely long vehicle. Not terribly wide, but it is a whopping 2 feet 8 inches long. That's approaching 3 feet. So this thing takes up a lot of shelf space if you want to display it in its complete form like this. But fortunately, it does separate into 3 components. The tractor vehicle, the cannon base, and the small tank at the end, the trailer vehicle, sometimes known as a artilleryman vehicle, which I'll discuss about that term a bit later when I get to it. Fortunately, in this combined form, it is actually rather stable. You could move it back and forth like a big old train. And in this form, you can actually turn the tractor vehicle as well as the trailer vehicle in order to simulate this thing turning. In order to disengage either the tractor or the trailer, you just simply lift the base off of what is a giant peg, which also doubles as a swiveling point for when you want to turn this thing. It is sometimes hard to convey just how large the tractor and trailer vehicle are, because they are not only removable components from what is basically a artillery playset in the middle of this thing, so you would think that Hasbro wouldn't put too much detail or effort into these components of the rest of the Thunderclap. And because this thing is such a squat, square vehicle, it kind of looks very small in photographs, but it actually isn't. Here's a 3 3/4 inch figure just to give you a size comparison. And as you can see, this thing is very, very close to a medium-sized vehicle. And you get 2 of these in the Thunderclap set. So that's very interesting. Now to go over the features, we have a cannon swiveling around on the top here. And of course we have 3 of these missiles, just one pegged on one side asymmetrically. The other 2 being on the other side here. Very interesting that the pegs are actually so close that the fins of the missiles actually kind of overlap. So not intuitively, you do have to put the top one on first and then the bottom one on the bottom here, because if you do it the other way around, the fins just kind of mash into each other otherwise. And then of course, this thing accepts a figure, so the whole canopy swivels out. There's a lot of nice sculpted in detail, so a little joystick, and you get one of those accursed seat belts, which, well, I'm going to call it accursed because I don't really like these seat belts, which dominated the 88 and 89 series of G.I. Joe vehicles. It's not too bad in this vehicle, but as we'll see as we go through the Thunderclap, the seatbelts are not really that necessary. The figure just sits in there like that. You just close the canopy right on top of him. It's rather unfortunate that the glass is just so darkly tinted that you can barely see whether there's a figure inside. If you swivel the guns out of the way, this thing also has a massive removable engine cover. I'll just flick it out from the bottom here. This isn't really a tab, it's just a lip which sticks out. So I'm not really sure if you're meant to grab it from this end or not, but it just seems to be easier, at least on my example, to do it from there. And this whole thing just comes off in one big piece. Not only did it cover the engine, which has actually a fair amount of detail, but only on one side, as well as it covered up this thing, which I'm not really sure if that's supposed to be a radiator or something like that. But as you can see, as my complaint is that on the other side, it's very plain. Like a lot of G.I. Joe vehicles, The tractor treads on this vehicle are fake. They do not move, but are highly detailed. But underneath we have these little dumbbell wheels to give it a bit of motion. We also have a bit of a transmission detail on the bottom here, which was unnecessary but rather cool nonetheless. Next, I'll take a look at the cannon base, the heart of the Thunderclap system. First, you're going to want to lower the support legs, just like that. There's two more on the other side. And next, actually you could do this at any point in time, but you need to extend the barrel of the cannon. There is no lock, it just sort of friction fits outwards and you just pull it out like this. And this becomes a really long cannon, as you can see. Also, as you might be able to see, mine is actually a little bit discolored at the tip and at the join here. Obviously, the previous owner of this must have kept it like this and it discolored this way. But honestly, while I could dip this in some hydrogen peroxide or maybe put some OxyClean on here to brighten it up, honestly, I kind of like the way this looks because it kind of looks burnt and a bit used. With the support legs down and out of the way, you can now swivel around the whole upper portion, which is the gondola, from the base, which is this gray piece down here. On each of the four corners of the gondola, we have these yellow platforms with foot pegs on them. So as you can see, you can actually put up to 4 figures per side, or up to 8 figures total on the outside of the cannon base. On the front end, and yes, I will be calling the front end this portion with the missile launcher. The missile launcher is actually kind of small. It kind of reminds me of the 1985 Snowcats missile launcher, where it's just kind of a top end of a hood rather than the full complete box. And as you can see, you can swivel it up and down and around. It comes with 3 of these small missiles. One fairly interesting thing about the missile launcher's tabs is that the middle one is actually farther forward than the other 2. I'm not quite sure why they did that, but it's kind of an interesting look. I guess in order to operate the missile launcher, we have a pair of seats with some really nice control panel detail in there. Of course, each of the seats has its own seat belt. Great. But it also has another problem. If you put a figure in there, you can clearly see that this thing has a Flintstones problem. And by that I mean there is no bottom portion and the figure's feet just kind of dangle out from the bottom of the gondola. I guess it doesn't really matter, it's not really terribly prominent. And on the back end we have a pair of defensive machine guns, which swivel all the way around. You wouldn't think that I'd have a problem with that, but I think they should have molded in like a stopper on the swiveling part, because you wouldn't want this thing to go all the way around and hit the back end of your cannon or the ammunition. But in order to operate these things, because they don't really have their own separate handhold, just like the front end, we have a pair of seats with a lovely pair of seat belts and some molded in cockpit detail in there for control panels. And speaking of that ammunition, you have 4 shells for the cannon, and they peg in there, these permanent pegs down there, and the shells themselves are pretty hollow. Here is the inner gondola floor with all 4 of the shells removed, and you can see that they didn't skimp on the details on the inside. But it's rather unfortunate that they didn't put foot pegs on the inside to make it look like figures could be standing in there perfectly steady and loading up this cannon. The cannon ratchets at this point right here. The ratchets are very fine, but they actually do hold in really well. I guess it's like multiple little layers of springs just around this ratcheting circle here. You will, however, notice that the main cannon itself also has a gigantic ratchet wheel, but as you can see, it's not hooked up to anything. Maybe somewhere in the design phase this would have had a third ratcheting point, but obviously it was taken out because these ones on the side, well, either side of the cannon, work just fine by themselves. You also notice that there is this little tower here, and when this thing is all the way down flat, it kind of rests on there. And now to the most interesting aspect of the cannon, and that is the shell loading and ejection. You have this lever here, you pull all the way back, and you can see that the chamber opens up. Now you can put a shell in there. You'll notice on the inside of the chamber there's this rectangular opening, and on the back of the shells, just underneath the lip, you'll see that there's one of two of these nubs. One of them you'll want to press inside and underneath that opening, like that. Now you can push the lever forward and it'll close up over the shell. And by pulling the lever back quickly, the shell ejects. And finally, we have the gunner seat. When you elevate the cannon, the seat can adjust to keep level. Now the seat itself has a lot of really nice detail, as well as a little nice little hand grip there. And while I don't really like the seat belts, obviously I'll keep harping on these things, honestly this is the only seat which really needs it. And here it is appropriately with long range sitting in the gunner seat. And now for the last component of the Thunderclap system, the trailer vehicle, or what the back of the box actually does refer to as a artilleryman vehicle. In other words, this was meant to be a second driver in the back of the whole train of the Thunderclap system in order to help steer it separately from the steering of the front. Now normally you see this on really large construction vehicles, removing the trailer vehicle from the rest of the cannon base. Just like the front end, it pops off of this rather large peg, which acts as both the connection point and the steering point as well. It's rather strange that Hasbro had made it this way, but this only connects to the back portion where the machine guns are. It cannot attach to the front end. And you can see on the tractor vehicle that the pegs are so very similar, but they're a slightly different size. The peg on the tractor vehicle is actually smaller than the one on the trailer vehicle. Just like the tractor vehicle, the trailer vehicle is stubby, kind of square, and really gives off the impression of a smaller vehicle than it actually is. Here's a 3 3/4 inch figure just to give you a sense of scale. This thing, like the tractor vehicle, is almost a mid-sized vehicle in its own right. And also like the tractor vehicle, the trailer vehicle has a roof-mounted, swiveling, double-barreled machine cannon. Unfortunately, it can't swivel all the way around because it hits into the antenna at the back there. It also has 3 missiles on this moving missile rack, which can move up like that. Rather fancy-looking missiles with this wasp-like front end. The trailer vehicle also had a unique feature in that the whole bottom half and the top half can swivel separately. I guess this goes along with the fact that this is supposed to be an extra turning point for when it's hooked up to the rest of the Thunderclap. Very interesting. Unfortunately, unlike the tractor vehicle, it doesn't have any detail on the bottom, but all of its 6 wheels roll separately. And last but not least, it has an opening canopy. The whole thing opens up like that. And you can see some nice detail in there. The whole canopy actually covered up this back portion with what I'm assuming is like some type of a fuse cover. One detail which I really admire about the trailer vehicle is the fact that they molded in some steps here which lead directly to the cockpit. This is an immersive detail which I wish a lot more other G.I. Joe vehicles and playsets actually had. Unfortunately, the trailer vehicle is the weak link when it comes to design and quality of the entire Thunderclap system toy. And while I kind of like the idea of the whole, separately moving tracks here to give the whole impression that this thing helps turn the massive Thunderclap vehicle, the fact of the matter is that this is an entire separate piece to the top half of the toy, meaning that the seat winds up being very shallow. If you wind up putting a figure in here, he winds up sitting a little bit too high here. So if you close this thing down, it honestly doesn't close down all the way. One very interesting thing, which I think that the Hasbro designers were trying to fix with that, is the fact that the hinges actually go up and down. But still, not only do you need a figure which does not have a helmet, but you still need to slouch it down. And now this thing closes completely. One very odd choice is the fact of the matter is that this thing has a whole armored canopy which covers almost all of the whole vehicle, and yet it has this hole at the back. What is that for? When I first saw that hole, I thought that was some type of removable panel which I was missing from the toy. But as it turns out, that's how it was designed, with that hole in there. Maybe it did have a removable panel at one point in time in the design stage, but it got removed just for budget reasons. And now we come to the quality issues. The yellow plastic is generally kind of waxy throughout the entire vehicle, but most of the parts which use the yellow plastic aren't really stress-related parts, except for the two parts on the trailer vehicle. As you can see, on this thing, the missile rack has a very odd way of connecting into what is the swivel joint here. And this often cracks off. As a matter of fact, in my parts bin, I actually found another missile rack. And you can absolutely see how this thing actually broke off. You can see the tab on one end, but there's no tab on the other because you had to squeeze them in order to fit it into that portion right there, and that puts a lot of stress on there. On top of that, you're looking at tabs which are on one side, and there's nothing on the other side to balance it out. So you wind up having to take off and put on the missiles, and that bends it even further. And then you're rotating it up and down during play. Again, that's even more stress on this thing, and I don't understand why this thing was designed the way it was. And of course, the caboose of any train acts as the communication center, so of course it got the antenna. And oh boy, are antennas the scourge of any G.I. Joe collector. These things pop off or crack off constantly on these vehicles, and this thing is often cracked off right at the tip there. Again, it's the yellow plastic which is kind of waxy and a little bit brittle over time. Now you're probably wondering exactly what I would consider the opposite number on the Cobra side to something as unique as the Thunderclap system. However, to me it's rather obvious, and that is, it's the 1987 Cobra Maggot. Now back when I had done my Maggot review, a lot of commenters said that I should have compared it to the 1988 Mean Dog, another vehicle which splits off into three, one of the components being a gun station. However, to me, that was a machine gun station meant for anti-aircraft, and the Maggot here is clearly an artillery cannon here. The Thunderclap was clearly based on the US M65 atomic cannon system, funnily nicknamed Atomic Annie. And this thing is exactly as it sounds. It is a gigantic cannon system which had to be towed into its range by one vehicle at the front and one vehicle at the back, and it fired an atomic payload. This was in the late 50s before ICBMs became a thing, I guess. Thankfully, this thing was never used in real combat, but if you're curious to know how it would have been used, check out this scene in the 1985 horror film Return of the Living Dead. They don't call it an Atomic Annie, but it totally is one. However, I think the model makers patterned it after the German Krupp K5 railway cannon. If it isn't abundantly clear by now, I really love the Thunderclap cannon system, despite the fact that it's actually based on a very terrifying real-world military vehicle. But I think that that's to its advantage because the real world vehicle that this is based on split off into component parts. And this thing does too. Now, a lot of G.I. Joe and Cobra vehicles do the same thing, but to me, there's always something a bit lacking in the way it does that. There's at least one component which, is kind of lame. But here, we have really well done front, back end, and a really great gimmick in the cannon itself. So that was to its advantage that it really integrates very well and separates very well on top of all that. Now, at the beginning of this review, I said that this thing is really long and takes up a lot of shelf space. However, as you can see, you can actually put a lot of G.I. Joes in and on it, meaning that this thing should become basically the center point to any G.I. Joe display for 88, 89, or even 1990. Included with the Thunderclap was Long Range, the driver, or artilleryman. Well, I'll get into that in just a moment. But first, I'll take a look at his accessories, because first he comes with a removable helmet. The helmet is highly detailed with a whole bunch of things, including what looks like a little scope over one eye. I'm guessing some of these components are maybe lights, infrared. His only other accessory is a unique small pistol. It's a nice little small scope pistol. I really like the overall color scheme of Long Range. Not only is it military and subdued, but it actually goes very well with the Thunderclap vehicle, which I'll get into in just a moment. But the one pop of color on this figure is his red hair. His face sculpt is really nice, kind of a stern expression, but the red beard gives off a Adventure Team Sea Adventurer vibe. Maybe that or Dr. Quest. He has a lot of really nice details all over his uniform, like the pouches almost on the side of his vest here, as well as one big grenade being held on by his slouching belts, and these long, I'm assuming like blast protective coverings over the lower parts of his legs. They all have nice little buckles all down them just to secure them onto his body. But he suffers from one of the things where a lot of the 88 and 89 driver figures in particular had this problem where they just didn't put a lot of detail, like painted detail, on him. A lot of this stuff should have been picked out in paint, and it just isn't. Even his eyes shouldn't have been the same red as the rest of his hair. They should have just opted to go with black because, well, they already have the black paint scheme on his holster. And here he is looking at home on the gunner's seat of the Thunderclap cannon. The two shades of green and the light gray go very well overall with the rest of the color scheme of the Thunderclap itself, something which you don't often see with a lot of driver figures. Usually they have clashing colors in order to make them stand out. But here he looks far more integrated than almost any other G.I. Joe driver figure. Even though throughout this review I've referred to him as a driver, that is basically a generic term. In a lot of ways, I don't really think that he is a driver. He is only an artilleryman. There's nothing in his file card, which you can read yourself when I put it up on the review. There's nothing in there to suggest that he understands heavy equipment operation. I'll just compare him to some other G.I. Joe artillerymen, like the 1984 Thunder here, and 1982 and 83 Grand Slam. So just who do I think the opposite number to Long Range is? Well, as I've already compared the 1987 Cobra Maggot to the Thunderclap, I think it's only fair to compare Long Range to the Maggot's driver, the 1987 Worms. While I really love the color scheme as well as the amount of detail that they put into the figure, the design has always struck me as some type of futuristic pirate, with his long boots, his red beard, and the fact that one of the scopes covers his eye like an eye patch. Of course, it doesn't help that I always place him in the gunner's seat of the gondola portion of the cannon, which itself looks like a boat. If you're looking for a complete Thunderclap or Long Range figure on the aftermarket, I do have to say that they're actually not really that high in value. Despite the fact that this thing was in the comic books and the cartoons, it just doesn't really have that high popularity that a lot of the other earlier large vehicles, large complex vehicles actually wind up getting. But this thing has been going up in value currently, so if you're planning on getting one, I should get one sooner rather than later. However, these are the components that you do have to look out for if you're looking for one. Now, each of the 3 components actually came with separate and unique 3 missiles. Of course, the cannon came with an extra 4 shells. On the trailer vehicle, you have to make sure that the missile rack doesn't have broken tabs at the back here. On the tractor vehicle in the front, it's rather strange that I have to say this, but sometimes I see these things without the engine cover, despite it being huge. But I guess the tractor actually does look kind of good, even without this component. It goes without saying that you have to look out for the antenna. There are 7 of these seat belts which go all throughout the vehicle, so you have to have those. As for the figure itself, well, the helmet is something which is fairly easy to find with the figure, but his pistol is not. That is a really hard item to find with this driver figure. Well, that's all the time I have right now. Please check out my Facebook page for more information and behind-the-scenes photos for these reviews. Thank you for watching this video, and stay tuned for next time to see another 1980s G.I. Joe toy review. See you then.